Spontaneous human combustion. It could happen to you. It's happening to me right now. The term spontaneous human combustion basically refers to the situation when a human body is found reduced to a pile of ashes, when no external source of ignition can be identified. Often there is minimal damage to the head and extremities and the person's surroundings. Wikipedia calls it a pseudo-scientific concept. Whatever, Wikipedia, I heard something different.
Spontaneous human combustion is real.
And that's all the proof I need. In 1470, Italian knight Paulinus Vorsius was drinking strong wine at his home in Milan. He then reportedly began vomiting fire before bursting into flames. That's actually kind of cool. This is considered to be the first recorded account of spontaneous human combustion. Another famous incident occurred in France in 1725, when a Parisian innkeeper was awoken by the smell of smoke. He went to investigate and he discovered that his wife, Nicole Millet, had been reduced to a pile of ashes while lying on a straw pallet, which itself was reportedly untouched by the flames. All that remained of Madame Millet, who it was noted was an alcoholic, was her skull, some bones from her back, and her lower legs. The surrounding area was reportedly unaffected. Her husband was charged with murder and found guilty. However, upon appeal, the judge agreed with his defense of spontaneous human combustion, thanks in part to the testimony of a surgeon named Dr. Claude Nicolas Lecat. The cat was actually staying at the inn at the time of the incident and corroborated the story. Hopefully Mr. Millet gave him some treats for helping out. The death was ultimately declared to be the result of a visitation of God. But who cares about these old-timey cases? Let's take a look at some more recent cases of spontaneous human combustion. On the morning of September 13, 1967, in London, England, a group of office workers were waiting for a bus when they noticed flames coming from an abandoned building. They called emergency services, who arrived approximately 5 minutes later. Upon entering the building, they discovered the burning body of Robert Francis Bailey, a local homeless alcoholic. Fire Officer Jack Stacy was first on the scene. Describing what he saw, he's quoted as saying, "There was about a 4-inch slit in his stomach, and the flame was emanating from that 4-inch slit like a blowtorch. It was a blue flame. The flame was actually coming from the body itself, from inside the body. He was burning literally from the inside out, and it was definitely under pressure. And it was impinging on the timber flooring below the body, so much so that the heat from the flame was charred into the woodwork. The fire brigade had to place the fire hose directly into the slit from which the flame was emanating to extinguish the fire. Bailey was lying on the bottom of the stairs, half turned on his left side, with his knees drawn up into his stomach. It appeared the man had been conscious and convulsing in pain as the fire consumed him. His teeth were buried so deeply into the wood that his mouth had to be pried open in order to remove him from the scene. Fire damage to the property was minimal. The only affected area was the floor directly below where the body had been burning. Aside from the abdomen area where the fire had originated, Robert Francis Bailey's clothes were intact and unaffected. The cause of death was ultimately deemed to be due to unknown causes. Investigators were unwilling to accept the possibility that this was a case of spontaneous human combustion. They cited Bailey's alcoholism as a probable contributor to the fire. They theorized that he may have consumed methylated spirits as a cheap form of alcohol, and that once in his gut, they reacted with some ignition source. There were, however, no external ignition sources found at the scene, and Bailey was a non-smoker. On December 22, 2010, Tom Mannion's smoke alarm went off in his home in Galway, Ireland. He went outside to investigate, and he noticed heavy smoke coming from the home of his neighbor, Michael Faraday. He banged on Michael Faraday's door to no answer. Emergency services were called, and they quickly arrived on scene. Once the fire was extinguished, police entered the home. Police officer Gerard O'Callaghan said that as he entered, he saw Faraday lying on his back in his sitting room, with his head closest to an open fireplace. Officer O'Callaghan told the coroner that the only damage he observed was to Faraday's remains, the floor beneath him, and the ceiling above him. The rest of the home had only sustained smoke damage. Firefighters were unable to determine the source of the fire. Assistant Chief Fire Officer Jerry O'Malley said that fire officers were satisfied that the open fire in Faraday's fireplace was not the source of the blaze. There were no traces of accelerants found at the scene, and there was no evidence that anyone else had entered the home. West Galway coroner Dr. Kieran McLaughlin officially ruled the cause of death as spontaneous human combustion, making this the first and only time in Irish history that there was an official ruling of spontaneous human combustion as a cause of death. Coroner McLaughlin was quoted as saying, "This fire was thoroughly investigated, and I'm left with the conclusion that this fits into the category of spontaneous human combustion, for which there is no adequate explanation." On September 17, 2017, just after 1 p.m. in Tottenham, London, England, onlookers watched in horror as John Nolan was ablaze on Orchard Place near Tottenham Hotspur's White Hart Lane Stadium. Some desperately tried to extinguish the flames, while others called for emergency services. When firefighters arrived, they extinguished the flames and rushed Mr. Nolan to Broomfield Hospital in Chelmsford, Essex, by air ambulance, where he unfortunately succumbed to his injuries the following day. He had sustained third-degree burns to 65% of his body. London Fire Brigade specialist investigators were reportedly unable to find anything at the scene that would have started the fire, and no witnesses interviewed reported seeing how the fire started. An early explanation of spontaneous human combustion was an imbalance of bodily humors. Back in the day, medical science was in such a state that it revolved around humors, or bodily fluids. These were blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each were a combination of 4 qualities: hot, cold, dry, and moist, and were believed to affect temperament and physical qualities and health. It is believed that an extreme deficiency or excess in any one of these humors could cause illness, and a moderate deficiency could explain certain behavioral patterns. And of course, a wild deficiency or excess could apparently cause you to burst into flames, which is pretty bad. You might have noticed that a lot of these cases mention the use of alcohol. In Victorian times, the prevailing theory for spontaneous human combustion was that the consumption of alcohol rendered the body flammable, due to alcohol obviously being flammable, depending on how diluted it is. The problem with this theory is that even in the most intoxicated individuals, the concentrations of alcohol in their bodies aren't enough to be flammable. I do not recommend, however, spilling moonshine on yourself and then lighting a candle. You probably will burst into flames. And now let's move on to the most widely accepted modern day theory to explain spontaneous human combustion, and the one that I personally believe. The wick effect describes when a person's clothing catches fire from an external ignition source, such as a cigarette. Their body fat then melts, which acts like the wick of a candle, creating conditions for a body to be able to smolder for an extended period of time, while leaving the surrounding area mostly unaffected. Essentially, you pass out smoking a cigarette, and the next thing you know, you're a pile of ashes. You may be wondering to yourself, just how flammable are these clothes that I have on right now? Unless you don't have clothes on right now, in which case I hope you're not in public. Just go put some clothes on. Anyway, luckily, they're a lot less flammable now due to the Flammable Fabrics Act of 1953, which regulated the use of flammable fabrics in clothing and other household objects. Now, this doesn't mean that your clothing is no longer flammable. Based on what I've seen, it's just a lot slower to catch fire. But again, if you were incapacitated due to intoxication or for any other reason, and you were unable to react to your clothing burning, it would quickly go out of control. I think the wick effect might explain why so many of these cases involve people that were drunk. I think it's a lot easier to not notice that your clothes are on fire if you're passed out drunk, or otherwise intoxicated to the point of incapacitation. And I think the wick effect theory is the most likely cause of one of the most famous cases of spontaneous human combustion, and that is the case of Mary Reeser. On the morning of July 2nd, 1951, Pansy Carpenter, a landlord at a small apartment complex at 1200 Cherry Street Northeast in St. Petersburg, Florida, awoke to the faint smell of smoke. She didn't think much of it at the time, but later on in the day, she was attempting to deliver a telegram to one of her tenants, Mary Reeser. She knocked on her door with no response. She noticed that the smell of smoke was now stronger, and when she tried the door handle, it was hot to the touch. She gained entry to the apartment with the assistance of some nearby house painters, and when they entered, what they saw were the cremated remains of Mary Reeser. The surrounding area and the apartment were relatively unaffected. The upper walls and ceiling were blackened from soot and smoke, while the lower half of the apartment was not. Light switches were melted, but outlets below were intact and functional. A stack of newspapers that was sitting nearby was undamaged. It was reported that Mary's skull had shrunk to the size of a cup. Parts of her spine remained, and her left foot was unburned, fully intact and still in her black satin slipper. The case initially baffled authorities, but ultimately it was concluded that Mary Reeser had likely fallen asleep while smoking and possibly ignited her nightgown, leading to the fire. Her son had visited her the night before and reported that she told him that she'd planned to take 2 sleeping pills and was smoking cigarettes in her easy chair. This unfortunate series of events could possibly be explained by the fact that it was not yet 1953 and by the wick effect. Mary Reeser may have taken those 2 sleeping pills and then fallen asleep while smoking, dropped her cigarette on her nightgown, which then caught fire. And because it was before 1953, and before the passing of the Flammable Fabrics Act, it may have been very flammable. And then of course the wick effect could have taken place, leading to a localized smoldering of body fat, leaving the surrounding area mostly unaffected. So after looking into this, I don't think that spontaneous human combustion is real, no matter what Unsolved Mysteries told me when I was a kid. And I was actually afraid of bursting into flames for like 6 months when I was a kid, because I saw it on Unsolved Mysteries. I think that most of these are just cases of people accidentally catching themselves on fire because they fell asleep smoking or, whatever. I also think that a lot of the investigations into these were flawed. For instance, it later came out that Jonathan Nolan from the Tottenham case did have a pack of cigarettes and 2 lighters on him, even though at the time it was reported that there was nothing that could have started a fire. As far as Robert Francis Bailey, I don't know what happened with that. That's pretty crazy. So I'm not saying that I have the answers to everything. But I don't think that you can just burst into flames. Anyway, thanks for watching, and please don't catch yourself on fire.